Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar on nutrition and adolescence. Before we introduce the speaker today, I want to take a quick moment to tell you about a few upcoming events and programs here at the Johnson Center. I know many of you are listening in from afar and may not be able to attend local events or programs. That's one of the main reasons why we provide this webinar series. Parents and professionals alike can register for any of our free webinars and have access to some helpful topics and experienced presenters. We host multiple webinars per month, so please visit our website at johnson-center.org to view the current 2016 schedule. But we are adding more, and so lots of exciting webinars to this year's series. So if you're not on the email list, I encourage you to visit our website and click on the Join Our Email List link that appears on the homepage. To get instant news and events and updates from the Johnson Center, you may also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, as we often announce grant and scholarship opportunities, research opportunities, and last-minute events and presentations there. You can find links for those on our website as well. We have a couple of exciting events coming up here in Austin. Our wonderful SIB Camp program is hosting several summer camps this year. Siblings ages 8 to 16 will have an amazing time while learning leadership skills and earning service hours. We'll also be hosting 2 social skills camps this summer for kids ages 6 to 16. For more information on these camps, contact our family care coordinator, Gina Hill. Contact information can be found on our website. Be sure to follow our colleagues at the Autism Research Institute as they host their own webinar initiative, and they share some great resources on their website and social media pages. Before we begin the presentation today, please note that questions may be typed into your control panel throughout the presentation, and time permitting, they'll be addressed during the presentation. For those of you who have requested copies of the presentation, we don't send out presentation slides, but we do post recordings of all of our free webinars on the Johnson Center YouTube channel. Please search for us on YouTube and subscribe to get full access to all of our recorded webinars. Additional resources and information will also be available on our blog found on our website. Again, that's johnson-center.org. We are offering certificates of attendance for this webinar, and a link to complete a short quiz will be emailed to you 1 hour following the presentation today. Today's webinar is being presented by Kelly Barnhill. Kelly is the Director of Clinical Services here at the Johnson Center for Child Health and Development. She is a certified clinical nutritionist with over 12 years' experience working with nutrition in children with autism and related disorders. At the Johnson Center, she directs a multidisciplinary team that has served thousands of children. Since 2008, Kelly has also been the nutrition coordinator for the Autism Research Institute. In this role, she designs and manages curriculum and training for hundreds of nutrition practitioners, as well as providing direct training for thousands of parents. Please welcome Kelly Barnhill.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to get right into it so we have lots of time for questions and comments so that I can address any particular concerns that our participants have today. My goals and objectives today really are rather simple. I'd like to tell you and take a look at what the research literature shows us about sleep, about exercise, and about nutrition, both for typically developing kids and also those with autism. I want to spend some time addressing this in the context of special dietary needs and therapeutic nutritional needs for those who have been on or are considering a specialized dietary approach or are considering therapeutic nutrition. I also want to discuss a reasonable game plan to speak to these concerns so that you kind of have a takeaway list after we finish speaking so that you have some ideas and objectives to follow when you leave this talk. And I apologize, it appears I'm having some difficulty advancing my slides, but I hope I'll get some technical support in here to help me with that shortly. Initially, I want to look at the impact of sleep requirements, of exercise needs, and nutritional needs on the adolescent body and brain. There's a lot of research out there now. It's not an arena that is at all. There's an ample body of research to draw from here. And I think some of it should be enlightening, I hope, because I hope it gives all of us a framework for understanding and looking at things in a little bit different light. For example, just for sleep, we all hear about our children and our adolescents whose sleep habits change, and you hear complaints about sleep habits of adolescents, but this is biologically driven and there is science behind it, and so I hope that just kind of reviewing that and talking about it a little bit gives you a different framework for processing how to manage it in your own home. I also want to look at and review the general knowledge we have from this literature, and then offer you the things that can be particularly applied with children who have been receiving specialized intervention or who have been looking at nutritional support in the past. I want to encourage you to send any questions as we go along through this, because I'm planning to stop several times to ask questions and field anything from you, because that might also guide us in terms of additional information that I have to share. So this is really where I want to start in looking at this big picture. We have a lot of families who come in and speak to us about increased concerns, increased behaviors, increased problematic behaviors from a parental perspective of their children. We've tracked many children for 10 or 12 years now, and so those 2-year-olds that we saw in 2004 and 2005 are now in adolescence, and so we've heard it quite a lot. And I just, to frame this in the big picture, I really want to be clear that teens are bombarded with lots of biological change in this time frame, and a child with autism is no different. Teenagers with autism, simply put, are teenagers first, and we need to remember that. They are, facing huge developmental changes that are inherent in just growing up. And what does that look like, and what are those specifics? Well, first of all, they face huge brain growth and changes. This is the time of largest brain growth since toddlerhood. They face circadian rhythm changes. So in addition to a lot of growth that's happening from a body and brain perspective, they also have hormones that are impacting how they experience the world coming on board. They face also, and really what this means in terms of brain development, in autism in particular, there are concerns with ongoing sleep issues. So research indicates that insomnia and corresponding daytime sleepiness can be an issue, particularly in kids with autism, and that's why I want to focus a little bit on that sleep issue today. We also know that anxiety seems to be a huge issue for teenagers with autism, and that's associated with puberty and adolescence onset. And I know that there are several other webinars we have on the horizon that will address that issue in particular, but just to put it out there as an underlying reason for really looking at this from a nutritional perspective to make sure that we're covering all of our bases to minimize the impact of that in your child and your life. And finally, the other real issue from a brain development perspective that can be of concern is seizure onset with puberty or adolescence. And while it does not happen in the majority of children who have autism, it is an increased risk factor for those with autism in this time in their lives. So it's just something to be aware of and respectful of, I guess. So I also wanted just to provide this information kind of as an overview for you to emphasize the huge range that we're talking about here, because from a medical perspective, from a healthcare perspective, from a nutritional perspective, adolescence really is this window of time that can begin as early as 10 years old or now even earlier and ends post 22, 23, 24. And we know that that's the case based on all the biological changes that we're aware of and primarily brain development in those later years. The changes in needs for sleep and exercise and nutrition in this huge window of time, they morph on an individual basis, and individual needs vary greatly. So while I'm going to give you some global big picture ideas, for each child, this window of time can shift in one direction or another. So what does the research tell us about sleep? In a survey conducted about 5 years ago, fewer than 20% of teenagers between the ages of 14 and 16 reported adequate sleep on their school nights. Sophomores in high school, that figure was 10%, and senior year, first term, that figure was 3%. We know, in general, as a society and a culture, we are sleep deprived. And while these figures might typically, they're derived from children who are overscheduled with sports and activities and school, this affects all of us, and it affects our children with autism as well. They have tight schedules too, and I think it's something that we need to think about in terms of sleep deprivation. We know that sleep in adolescence is linked to increased blood pressure, increased rates of obesity, and increased type 2 diabetes. It's also linked to mood disorders, mood concerns, depression, suicidal ideation, significant risk-taking behavior, and impaired cognitive function. When you're not sleeping, your brain can't do its job, simply put. We also know that there are car accidents and safety concerns in any environment. Car accidents clearly has been the most researched. There is some data out there suggesting that teenagers who are driving in a sleep-deprived state have the same level of impairment as those with who are under the influence of alcohol, which is pretty profoundly disturbing. But that, in general, can be translated across other opportunities for errors in judgment as well. So how much sleep do our children need? Well, in terms of sleep duration and recommendations, I wanted to put this up. It's presented by the National Sleep Foundation, and if you go to their website, you can actually find a lot of information that is helpful in understanding this issue more thoroughly. I think that what I want you to glean from this ultimately is, if you look at the middle column and what they're terming school-age kids from 6 to 13 years, and then teens, see how that shifts. So it's not truly a decrease over time, and it's certainly not an increase, which a lot of parents will tell you, my child sleeps all the time now that he's a teenager. But in fact, sleep needs remain fairly constant, shifting from 9 to 11 hours to 8 to 10 hours in that window of time. So in terms of sleep cycles, this is another thing that's really interesting in the literature, and this is kind of what I want to focus on for us. Sleep cycles for children shift dramatically as they enter adolescence. And if you recall, a few minutes ago I mentioned that there were some concerns with insomnia and daytime sleepiness in children with autism and adolescents with autism. But for me, I think we need to take into account when we hear things like that we need to, as parents, to start respecting the biological clock, that rhythm that our children are in, because biologically it is difficult for them to sleep until much later in the evening. So if you have a child who's been an 8 o'clock bedtime kind of person, or a 9 o'clock bedtime, or a 10 o'clock bedtime, entering adolescence, moving through puberty, their requirements, body and brain is going to be telling them, don't go to sleep yet. And on average, that sleep phase shift time is about 2 hours. So up to midnight, typically. So if your child simply cannot go to sleep in that window of time that you've done for the past 5 or 6 years of his life, I would suggest kind of thinking through respecting that and not viewing it through the eyes of, this is a sleep issue, this is an insomnia issue, this is a sleep concern, but rather, okay, this is normal human development, and I need to be doing what I should be doing to acknowledge that, and shift my expectations that he now needs to adhere to a 9 o'clock bedtime, even though he's 13 or 14 years old. It's normal. It is okay And as parents, I think we need to respect it because it's compounded by a lot of other things too. And the other factors that are involved are actually things that we do have some control over. But with this sleep shift, we also have the issue of the hormones coming into play. We have caffeine consumption, which is often an issue with children who are tweens or teens because they now have a little bit more autonomy in their environment. So for children who have been on a specialized diet for a period of time, this is either a time when their dietary limitations are expanded so that they have some more options, or they have an ability to purchase things on school grounds, or they have access to food that they would not otherwise have, and soft drinks and sodas become a part of their routine. In terms of other factors that are involved, electronic usage is way up, and we know what that does in terms of dysregulating sleep. So I guess my takeaway on this for you is respect that there's a biological shift here, and you need to honor that, but you can control or contain some of these other components with meaningful parameters in your child's life. So to do that, acknowledge the changes in your child. Recognize that this child that you worked so hard to get on a bedtime routine, or you worked so hard to keep in bed all night long, or you worked so hard to settle after multiple awakenings when he was 4 or 6 or 8, is responding to biological changes in his body. And it's okay. But saying all that, practice good sleep hygiene. So what I would suggest is following all those rules about no electronics at least an hour before bedtime, no caffeine preferably, or minimal caffeine if you can't do no caffeine, and certainly no caffeine after 3 or 4 p.m. And then any other things that are needed to support a solid night's sleep so that adolescent brain can rest and grow, because that's what's happening in that time frame. Blackout shades, noise machines, whatever tools are necessary to be successful at that, I encourage you to talk to your child about, because you want the child to be involved and have some control over this as well. You want to provide adequate nutrition at the appropriate times of day. So ideally, you're going to bed 2 or 3 hours after a full meal. What that looks like in terms of adolescence, if you have a child who's ravenous at bedtime, then find a bedtime snack that will keep him full and not waking in the middle of the night to forage in the pantry. Discuss the pros and cons of catch-up sleep at the weekends with your spouse or other caregivers, or with your child as well, because this whole tendency to stay up late, get up early for school, and then sleep 12 or 14 hours on Saturday and Sunday really does a further disservice to the circadian rhythm, and it all, puts the body in this constant state of unknown. And I suggest, trying to kind of remedy that or make a plan for addressing it so that that's not the standard. Certainly there are exceptions, but it's better to be the exception in this case rather than the rule. And finally, I put this in here particularly for families who are really struggling with very early school starts. We have some schools that start very early, 7 o'clock, 7:05. Some children have to be awake several hours earlier than that, to the extent that it completely disrupts the child's life, the child's health, the child's behavior, and therefore family life. And I really think there's enough evidence out there in the scientific literature now, and there's precedent in other school settings that acknowledging this is an issue and opting for a later start or opting for early school requirements that fade in over time to a reasonable start time, because there are recommendations from several national groups that say adolescents should be starting in the 9 o'clock range rather than in the 7 o'clock range, that could accommodate some of these needs and help the child and support the child through their school years. So are there any questions now on this particular, on the things that we've talked about so far? In terms of sleep, in terms of the big picture information that we have, so we have a few questions that have come in so far. Is there a way to limit electronics before bed, and what kind of tips do you have? So it depends on the child that you're working with, and in the case of any teen or tween at this point really who has access to electronics, I think you have to have their buy-in in terms of whichever path you choose. And really, that would be things like a contract for, okay, between 9 and 11, here are the activities that are okay. The computer, the iPad, the phone need to be put away at 9 p.m. Families handle this a number of different ways, so check the phone in, check the iPad in, check the computer in downstairs, and use a standard clock. More and more professionals are recommending banishing all electronics from the bedroom based on what we know about how it disrupts sleep patterns, and relying on that science and making that case to your children might make it a little more palatable as you work it through. I certainly don't think that this is a rule that should be implemented for one child and not all in the household. But I think as long as it's written down from a visual schedule perspective or a contract perspective, and it's clearly defined and also has the child involved as a component of that decision making, you can come up with a plan that will work for you and your family. I'm going to move on now and talk a tiny bit about exercise, but if you have other questions about sleep in particular, I encourage you to take a look at a webinar that we did in January of this year, I think, called Caring for the Caregiver. It's on our YouTube channel, and I spent a lot of time at that point talking about sleep and supporting good sleep. We talked about foods that are good for sleep. We talked about supplementation. Again, this was in the context of adult caregivers, but I think a lot of it would apply other than specific products, which you'd probably need professional guidance on to see if they would apply in dealing with teenagers. But I gave some really specific examples about creating a schedule for electronics, for example, issues with, practicing good sleep hygiene and creating a room that you want to sleep in. So I encourage you to check that out if you have other questions. I want to shift now and talk about exercise just for a tiny bit. Clearly, exercise is really one component of overall health in my mind. So those three keys are exercise, sleep, and nutrition, and I feel each of those give the body and the brain the opportunity for best success. So I just want to say that moving the body physically is really important for all of us, and we need to make a way to prioritize that for our children because it's going to be key to overall health in the moment, in adolescence, and also in their longer-term lives. So what does the research tell us about exercise? First, we know that lifetime habits regarding exercise are built in adolescent habits. That's pretty straightforward. We know that those who are committed to an exercise plan at 16 will carry that with them through life if it's a priority then. And I think building those habits for our kids in particular is key. We also know, the research tells us about exercise in general and also exercise in teenagers specifically, that exercise and the corresponding endorphin creation is linked to decreased stress, decreased anxiety, and decreased depression. And for the children that we see and that we work with, I feel it's really important to do anything we can to ameliorate the impact of anxiety on their day-to-day lives. We know that exercise or lack of exercise is linked to bone mass. So exercise in adolescence builds bone mass that lasts a lifetime. Lack of exercise in that window doesn't lay down the bone matrix that ideally we would want, and there are lifelong complications that may present later. We know that exercise is important in growth, and we know that it plays a role in blood sugar levels. I include this information about blood sugar levels both from a type 2 diabetes development perspective, but also from the perspective of a nutritionist who has worked with children for years and years and years. And I know that our kids are very sensitive to fluctuations in blood sugar, and that anything we can do, from healthy snacks every 2 or 3 hours to exercise, to maintain stability with that, offers the child and family an abundance of stability, I guess. So planning time for exercise will help your child work through some of those blood sugar highs and lows that one can experience with meal skipping, food issues. So layering in exercise can diminish the impact of that on mood, behavior, stress levels. So exercise doesn't need to look like this for your child. Sometimes when we talk with families about exercise, they're overwhelmed with what that actually looks like, or how it is, how to work it into an already busy schedule. And everyone is different. This is just a photograph from a standard CrossFit teenage class in a gym, but it doesn't need to be this. It really truly can be anything that moves the body, builds bone mass, and builds muscle mass. It can be walking the family dog on a regular basis. It can be working with a trainer at school. I mean, again, this is a way to move something meaningful into your child's school day that will be assistive and supportive for long term. So you can talk to the school either through the context of an ARD meeting, through the development of a 504 plan, to look at how to get meaningful physical education activity in that window of time for your child. It can be working with a private trainer. It can be a team sport that your child loves and participates in regularly, both in practice and events. It can be time spent with a physical therapist if your child continues to see a physical therapist or an occupational therapist for their work. It can be yoga. It can be stretching. It can be swimming. The important part, I guess, is to acknowledge that this component of your child's health is really key, and it needs to be incorporated for both short and long-term health. And because we become so focused on other aspects of taking care of our children, sadly, it's something that a lot of us neglect. So what are my practical tips? They're pretty simple, really. The literature tells us that adolescents need 3 hours of bone building work, 3 hours of muscle building exercise, and 3 hours of aerobic activity per week. And it can take, it can look like whatever you think is best for your family. There are multiple resources that you have access to that can help you develop a plan that will accommodate your family and your child's individual needs. If you'd like more information on a particular program that we are familiar with and really are impressed with, I would see David Geslak's work, which is found at exerciseconnection.com. He primarily works with children with autism and helps school districts, therapists, families incorporate an exercise routine into their children's lives. And whatever path you take, I suggest you find a group, find support for this decision in your life, and find a way to make it happen, because it will serve you and your child well. Okay, so now I want to move on and talk about that third component, really, of health, and spend a lot of time talking about what we know about teens in general, what we know about special diets in particular, and how to kind of wrap all of that together in a way that will be helpful for your child moving forward. So in general, nutrition through the life cycle is a very well-studied science. We know a number of things about nutritional needs and requirements of adolescents. And that really is fairly straightforward. We know that the need for total caloric intake goes up fairly dramatically for male adolescents, somewhat dramatically for females. We know that protein intake need increases, and that's primarily because we're bone building, because we're laying down bone and we need those amino acids for that as well as tissue growth. We know that our need for vitamin B12 increases significantly. Calcium and magnesium needs increase, potassium as well, but less so in terms of amounts. And again, that speaks to that bone building component that I mentioned earlier. And we know that the need for iron doubles in adolescence, and that's largely because once a child starts menstruating, blood loss leads to iron, can lead to iron deficiency. I also want to be clear that all of these nutritional recommendations that I'm speaking to right now refer to adolescents across that huge window that I showed you earlier, so 9 to 24-year-olds essentially. The biggest jump in nutritional requirements is for that 14 to 18-year-old group. So those children who are passing or have passed through puberty and are beginning that huge adolescent growth spurt, that's when all of these nutrient needs kick in. So for some kids, that could be 12. For some kids, that could be 16. And you and the professionals that you work with really need help. That's how you get help in defining, okay, when is the right time for us to be shifting and thinking about this from an increased dietary and nutrient need perspective. So what are practical tips for addressing diet? Well, first, remember that you want to provide additional healthy calories. They should come primarily from protein and fats as these requirements increase in adolescence, but interestingly, the need for carbohydrates in the body doesn't change in that window. The caveat here for me is children who are athletes or highly active certainly need to be including more carbohydrates in their intake from an energy perspective, but those should be healthy carbohydrates. Those should not be junk food carbohydrates. I think one component of doing this is reverting to that plan that we have for 2 and 3-year-olds when they're going through this huge spurt, and that is offer food every 2 to 3 hours in a healthy way. So breakfast snack, lunch snack, dinner, bedtime snack if needed. From a brain growth perspective, their brains are doing just what their brains were doing when they were tiny. And we need to see that from an energy perspective and offer that brain the nutrition it needs. I think you need to build a reasonable daily plan. Recognize that it will look different than that of a younger child. So if you have multiple children in your household and you have younger children, your portion sizes should be significantly different between your 7-year-old and your 13-year-old. And that's something that as parents we get so close to this that we can't see that that's actually what's happening. But remember, earlier in this talk I mentioned that at some points their children's energy intake needs double, and some research says it can as much as triple. And so that you need to start seeing that in the context of calories in and portion size and what that looks like. So how do you, I guess, keep healthy foods available for this plan and be successful with a teenager? For me, I think empowering your child to the extent that you and he or she are able is the way to go. So setting up a snack basket in the pantry and a snack basket in the fridge of healthy anytime foods that they can go to and control their intake within reason. And if you have particular concerns with not being able to acknowledge satiation or not stopping, that's an issue we can talk about later as well. But hopefully, in terms of turning over some of the control about food choice to your child by placing foods in those places and saying, you are welcome when you're hungry in these windows of time. So provide all the rules and the parameters, however it's best for you and your child. So a schedule, a talk, prompts that are on the pantry and on the fridge, whatever it takes to help both of you remember, okay, let the child be in control of this choice. I think that's a good start. So in terms of building a reasonable daily plan, start with something that is high protein, high fat for breakfast. Look at, depending on what, if your child is vegetarian, depending on, you want to make sure that you get vegetable protein in there in the form of a smoothie of some kind. There are several good options out there now for that. If your child consumes animal products, think about eggs and think about breakfast meats, whatever that looks like. Focus heavy on lean proteins, healthy fats, and then healthy carbohydrates. So primarily from vegetable sources, reasonable grains, reasonable fruit. And that's the plan that's consistent if you look at recommended dietary intake across populations and across diets. That's what the research is coming out and telling us, that your plate should be primarily vegetables, healthy protein and fats, a little bit of fruit, a little bit of grains. I would, put your child in charge of packing something in that backpack for a mid-morning snack and also a mid-afternoon snack if you have that luxury. Teach the plan to your child. This is when you want to start giving the child control and ownership of as much of this process as possible so that it becomes a lifelong habit. And you will be successful short-term and your child will be successful long-term if you're able to do this. A couple of caveats. Lunch is a growing time of independence for preteens and adolescents. And anything we can do to help them make safe choices in the context of a group setting, in a peer setting, is it's good. So if that means having your teen pack their own lunch within guidelines that you give them, if that means talking to the school and working through options that may possibly work from the school lunch line, do that. Anything you can do to help your child in the context of their peers do something similar but not unhealthy is the way to go. For those of you out there who are thinking about everything I'm saying right now in terms of special diets, starting a special diet or continuing a special diet or revising a special diet, I just want to say, know that whatever protocol you were considering or looking at, it can be done. Don't be discouraged about your child's age, about your child's development, don't be discouraged. I have a number of colleagues. Pam Farrow works with many teen clients, and Pam always says, it's challenging, it's emotional, but it can be done and you shouldn't give up. So while there are all these barriers to success, I think they can be, it can be achieved if it's something that you want, as long as we can work hard to get your child on board with that decision as well. And part of that really is, don't make any food available in your home that you don't want your child to eat, because this human being, this adolescent, is now fully aware that you have pasta or you have bread or you have things in your pantry that you do not want him to eat that you may eat. And this is not like hiding dark chocolate from your 2-year-old. This is a human being who is fully aware that they are missing out on some food. So don't make it available in your home if you're not willing to share it with everyone who lives there. So in terms of practical tips, just to increase protein, so speaking to those specific needs that we know from a dietary perspective come along with adolescence. How do you increase protein? Well, morning shakes with added protein powder are a good way to start. There are good, healthy, organic protein powders out there that are either they can be egg-derived if your child can tolerate egg protein. There's also rice protein that is now screened and organic. There's hemp protein. For some families, there are options that are whey protein powders from A2 milk, which is essentially a type of milk from cows that do not carry beta casein, which contains the casein component that many people are responsive to. And that's available pretty much across the country now. From a grains perspective, adding grains such as amaranth and quinoa can be helpful in bolstering protein content of the diet. Legumes add protein. Healthy animal protein includes a number of different things. I've listed some here. I just want to point out I've added yogurt and kefir as tolerated only. We have some children who consume cow's milk, goat milk, sheep milk, dairy products with no problem. We have some children who cannot tolerate those proteins, but those are good sources. These two forms of those dairy products in particular are good sources both for probiotic content and also protein content. In terms of building B12 status in the diet, I encourage you to think through this one carefully, particularly for children with specialized nutritional needs. So if you've been working with a professional who has put your child on therapeutic nutrition, if you've had any B12 supplementation, if you did that at one time and you're thinking about restarting, I encourage you to work with a professional to help decide what that dose should be, because these needs can vary widely. You don't want female adolescents to be deficient in B12 because that's another component that factors into anemia concerns in some respects. So everything that we can do to support the child in terms of iron access and availability decreases the risk of iron deficiency. Ultimately, I feel like in this window of time, added supplementation to get to the level that we need is probably necessary for most children, because when you start talking about the level of nutrition found from dietary sources, it requires an abundance of foods that most teenagers won't touch. It requires, there are various factors here, but I feel like it's reasonable to assess and assume that B12 supplementation is appropriate. I say again, I encourage you to speak with professionals about this, only because there are multiple forms of B12. Some are more available than others, and some are more useful to our bodies than others. And choosing the right form is also part of the science of all of this, so that you're not spending money on a supplement that really provides no benefit to your child. So food sources include primarily animal protein, so small fish, sardines, anchovies, beef, and beef liver are primary sources of B12. This is why B12 is a guaranteed supplement for a vegetarian or a vegan who's doing and managing that dietary approach well. In terms of calcium and magnesium increase, again, I would say think through supplementation of these minerals, because it's likely, particularly if you're talking about females, that this will be necessary. I think that food sources are things that you can incorporate and rotate into a diet, but you're talking about an increase that's almost 50% of dietary requirements in that window of time. And so that's a huge jump in terms of both nutrient need and also dietary intake, and teaching your child the importance of suddenly increasing by such a substantial amount. Food sources would include yogurt and kefir, as I mentioned, small fish again, so sardines, anchovies, nuts and seeds, and dark leafy greens like chard and spinach and collard greens, turnip greens. Those are all really good sources of calcium and magnesium. But again, even if you start rotating this into the diet, it needs to be a fairly good portion of dietary intake on a daily basis, and supplementation, short-term or long-term, may be beneficial. For females, an increase in iron is important. So food sources include nuts and seeds, beef and beef liver, chicken liver, legumes like white beans and lentils, and dark leafy greens that I mentioned earlier. You know, these are all very healthy sources of food. And I only want to point out the beef liver, and chicken liver components are things that you need to pay particular attention to, because beef liver and chicken liver, those are organs that consolidate toxins in the body, and they process toxins in the body. So if you choose, and I think there are very good sources for beef liver and chicken liver now, they need to come from very clean, organic, or locally grown and raised cattle and poultry, because there can be concerns about exposure to toxins through those dietary components that you wouldn't want to share with your child. So now I have a long list of questions here, but I also want to encourage you to keep sending them along. And I'll wrap up in a bit with some more recommendations in terms of specifics and takeaways. So one of the questions we got was, how do you get your school to support good snack choices? And I think there are a number of ways to go about that. With families that we work with, despite the need for, I guess, acknowledgement of teens' independence and growing individual responsibility, I think that introducing yourself early in the school year or early in the process is important, and providing as much information as possible to the teacher, the aide, anyone in the system, essentially, who will come into contact with your child and either offer them food or offer an opinion about their food. Be as open and as honest with them about your concerns for your child as you can be. It's really important to provide, in my opinion and our experience here, as much as a list of, I don't want my child to have these things because whatever the reason is, there's an allergy, there's an intolerance, it's not healthy food. That list is important, but it's more important to give them a go-to list. So my child can eat any fruit on this list. My child can eat any vegetable on this list. These 10 recipes are really good snack ideas that I'll provide for my child and can be kept on hand. And part of that also is getting your child on board with that too, so that everyone is on the same page, and the teacher particularly understands the importance of this issue to you. How do you get your child to buy in to making healthy choices? It can be an easy process, or it can be a harder process depending on the child that you're speaking of. But I really recommend starting from ground zero and talking every decision through to the best of your ability with that child, and then providing follow-up that's either visual, or a visual schedule, or a contract, or a checklist, whatever you can offer and provide that will give them concrete information in being successful. So some of the children that I work with who are moving into adolescence, we create checklists. So every morning when they pack their lunch, They check the box for vegetable, they check the box for protein, they check the box for fat. We provide images of what are healthy, what are healthy options in each category that you want in that lunch bag or in that snack. The harder part is honestly regulating what they're exposed to outside your home and kind of sussing that out. And I think that talking about vending machines and why that's not an option is one way. Talking about vending machines and helping them know what's okay to pick out of the vending machine is another option. So if there's any option at all in a soda machine, like a sparkling water drink, and there are some of those that are good and some that are not good, but something that would allow them to participate in that activity at school but also meet their requirements for dietary intake are important, I think. So thinking it through and providing as much information as you can to help them be successful, not just a no-no list, seems to be the best effort. You can get information about food written into a 504 plan. You can get information about food written into an IEP, and then the school will be required to do that on behalf of your child. You can carry that forward and just call it an administrative detail when you discuss it with teachers, but they'll know that you're serious about it at that time. How do you help a teen who is gaining too much weight? I think there are a lot of nuances here, and with a single question, I don't think that I can give enough of a helpful answer, but I can say the things that you need to be thinking about are it's not uncommon for a young teen who is moving into puberty and early adolescence to gain weight before they lengthen out. So a year, 18 months of time where they're a little bit heavier than you would think they had been or might be, that's kind of normal. That's a hormonally driven thing. They're primarily in girls, sometimes often in boys, but they're holding on to that body fat to drive future growth. And I think that if we're talking about a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old who might be in that window of time, I would say keep an eye on dietary intake and don't make a big deal about it if you feel like intake is not excessive. If you're talking about excessive intake where the child cannot recognize satiation and hunger, I think that's a different issue and probably requires professional guidance. But if you're talking about a child who's in that window of time, I think keeping a watchful eye on it, but otherwise just, making sure you're aware of what's happening but not intervening is an appropriate call short term. If you're talking about an older teenager who has gone through a significant growth spurt and then started gaining weight over time, I would suggest maybe being a little more assertive in intervening in that. So tracking caloric intake perhaps by yourself or with the help of a professional, looking at other factors that might be weighing in there if caloric intake hasn't increased dramatically. And remember, in that window, caloric intake really can increase dramatically to the 3,000 calorie range-ish. And in that, it's hard to know with all the factors in play what might be driving it. But if your pediatrician could be a resource here because you'd probably want to rule out the impact of anything like sluggish thyroid function that might also be compounding what that picture looks like. So I guess I would get, in the absence of that scenario I mentioned earlier with a younger child who's just entering puberty and adolescence, I would gather as much data as you can to help you decide what the best intervention plan for gaining weight might be if you've addressed all the other factors. So caloric intake is reasonable, your child is exercising, your child is sleeping, because we do know that decreased sleep can impact weight gain. So I just received a question on melatonin. What is your opinion on melatonin use to help sleep? I think that I I don't have an issue with supportive products for sleep purposes, particularly in this window of time when sleep can be dysregulated for so many reasons. I talk about this kind of in a more thorough fashion in the webinar that I mentioned earlier, and you might want to reference that. Again, it's in reference, that webinar spoke particularly to adults, but my thoughts on melatonin here stand. I think that ideally it is something you use in times of setting patterns and habits, and then can fade away potentially. But I don't think we don't have any data that tells us we should not be using this with children, and we should not be using it long term at this point. Do you have any suggestions on addressing pickiness and food selectivity reported in kids with ASD? Yes, there are, I hate to refer you out to, but we have several webinars that talk about this and give families particular guidance, and I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and also the autism.com, the ARI website, because there are several there as well that give fully comprehensive approaches to working with picky eating and food selectivity behavior in younger and older children that would be applicable to adolescents as well. Suggestions for teens with gagging issues with food. I think that my response would be that which I just shared with you, and that is please go and check out these other webinars that you'll find online for comprehensive information on that topic. But regarding gagging, I have many questions about that. Is it a new gagging, or is it a continued behavior of sorts? Are there other issues involved? Has the child been diagnosed with reflux? Has the child had a gastrointestinal workup with a gastroenterologist just to rule out any confounding factors? How much is it interfering with the child's eating behavior and their growth trajectory? All of those things, I think, are, that's the short list of questions I have in my head as I think through that right now. But ultimately, with regard to a teen who is gagging, and that's a new behavior that may be interfering with food intake and growth, I would say you probably need professional guidance and help, and you can start with your pediatrician or a knowledgeable dietitian or nutritionist who could then help you gather the data you need to decide what the next steps could be. A family just asked what our thoughts are on cod liver oil, and do you continue to give it without any break? I tend to use cod liver oil for nutritional support for vitamins A and D, and less so essential fatty acids, because we primarily get those from fish oils. But typically we use it in children who tolerate it, will continue to take it without a break. I know that there are some practitioners who recommend rotating through it, using it sometimes and not all. And my experience is, as long as we are working closely with families and following a child's nutritional status every 6 months, or at most every year at an annual appointment, I'm confident that the levels that we dose cod liver oil in were not impacting, we don't have any health concerns in terms of fat-soluble vitamin overload or other issues that might arise, as long as we're confident in the product and the dosage. I only have a few other questions here. If you have thought of anything that we have not gotten to, as I realize our time is running short, please feel free to email us, and I will get back to you personally via email with my thoughts. And I appreciate your time and attention. The last question I have is from a family in Venezuela, and they say, due to the critical economic conditions, how and what can we feed our teens when access to food is very limited? How can we prepare a balanced meal with limited resources? So without specific information on the foods that you do have available, I struggle a little bit, but I would say to you the focus should be on protein, reasonable protein intake at each meal, so 4 ounces of healthy protein that's available. 75% of that meal can come from vegetable sources. So any dark leafy greens, any vegetable, any, thinking about what you have available and then making a schedule that rotates through some of that or relies on it consistently, I think it can be done, and I'm happy to help you with that question further if you want to email me directly. So thank you so much. I want to take a few minutes now and go through really what a reasonable plan moving forward should look like. Number one, if at all possible, consult with a professional, a dietitian or nutritionist who's knowledgeable both in adolescent health and also kids with autism and any specialized diets can make a world of difference as you move forward. A practitioner who is able to order laboratory tests such as a consulting physician or your pediatrician to help guide that nutritional plan as you move into this window of time would be extremely helpful. That can, there are a number of labs that are helpful in this window for us. It gives us a baseline and it allows us to know your child's needs at age 13, which are so different than when testing started when they were 6 or when they were 8. And it allows us kind of both to understand what's going in from a dietary and supplement perspective, and also what lab results show us is actually being utilized and is helpful, and make any changes and augment any intake as needed based on that. Address sleep habits and sleep need changes. Recognize that your teen is going to want to sleep at different times. That's a hard one for most of us. Their sleep will be essentially as long as they had in previous years, but it will just be in different hours. And if you can help them own that, and if you can own that, you will make a big difference in your child's health. It doesn't need to look the same for every child. So if you have a child who is still comfortable going to bed earlier, that's great. I'm not suggesting you push bedtime later. I'm just suggesting that when that happens, don't look at it so much as a problem, but as an, okay, I knew this step was coming. Now, what should I do with it? Make an exercise plan that works for your child and your family. I know Exercise Connection is a great resource that's out there, but there are locally options as well, and it doesn't have to be complex and it doesn't have to be hard. Just make your child move his or her body. Make that food plan that we talked about. Don't be afraid of increasing caloric intake for your child. If you have a child who is gaining weight in a way that you feel might not be appropriate, figure out if that's a dietary intake concern, if it's an exercise concern, and take that data to a professional in some way and in some capacity who could help you make an educated decision on what to do with that. From a supplement perspective, at a minimum, I think you can look at adolescent targeted multivitamins and minerals. There are a number of those products out there on the market now that look at the increased nutritional needs of adolescents. They don't quite plot like adults, and they're not the same needs that younger children have. So choosing that product with a professional, because those are the ones that I would recommend are primarily professional lines, would be helpful. And then I would suggest addressing therapeutic needs, because dosages change over time. The dosages you want to be using today with a child who's 13 are not the ones that you wanted to use even 2 years ago with a child who was younger. They're going to change dramatically in this window, and having guided assistance with the use of current intake and also laboratory testing would be highly beneficial moving forward. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please see the link that I've put here for you. That quiz will be available in approximately 1 hour, and you will get an email prompt to that effect.